Okay, let's try and unpack this. Why did history turn out so differently across the continents? We're talking the last 13,000 years or so.
The big question, isn't it?
It really is. And right off the bat, let's be crystal clear. This has nothing to do with people being inherently different or superior. Nope. We're pushing that aside entirely.
Absolutely. That's not the answer.
What we are diving into is how the environment, the hand each continent was dealt, fundamentally shaped the long-term paths of human societies.
Precisely. And, there's just a mountain of information out there on this. So think of this deep dive as maybe your quick way to get a really solid handle on this foundational question.
Yeah, a way to cut through the noise.
We're leaning heavily on Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, as many of you probably know. It tackles this exact issue.
So our mission today, it's focused. We're not just scratching the surface. We really want to get down to the bedrock, the ultimate long-term environmental factors.
The deep causes.
Exactly. The things that pushed societies onto such different tracks across the globe. Forget the simple stuff. We're going deeper.
Okay, so where do we even start with something this huge? Let's go way back. The first spread of humans.
Right. Across the planet.
The ice ages were absolutely critical here. They were like
Yeah.
global architects, right? Creating land bridges.
Which then disappeared when the ice melted and sea levels rose.
Exactly. And bam, right there, the planet's geology forced a split.
Yeah.
Continents became these isolated sort of human development labs.
Take Australia and New Guinea. Getting there, even when seas were lower, meant crossing real stretches of open water.
Yeah, and Australia, incredibly, was always out of sight from the nearest Indonesian islands. Always.
Wow. So those first people, they had to have boats, which is just amazing evidence for early technology.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, compare that to the Americas, it's a different story. Settlement there, well, it either needed boats,
Yeah.
and the clear evidence for those comes much, much later, or it meant crossing the Bering Land Bridge. But that wasn't even possible until people had populated Siberia, which again happened later. The timing for that first arrival in the Americas is still, well, it's fuzzy. Maybe 14,000 years ago, maybe as far back as 35,000. It's debated.
Okay. But then you get this almost like explosion, the Clovis culture, around 12,000 BC in Alaska.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
And within just a few centuries, maybe, their spear points, their tools, they're showing up everywhere, North America, down into Mexico. It's like they just burst onto the scene.
And suddenly Clovis sites are all over. Pretty soon after, you even see signs of people way down in Amazonia, Patagonia.
That fast spread, I must have had huge impacts, right, on the environment.
Oh, definitely. Which leads us right into the whole megafauna extinction puzzle.
Yeah.
Giant animals disappearing.
Right. In Australia and New Guinea, it happens around the time humans first show up. And it's not just in one place. It's across the board.
Yeah, from the really dry center to the wet rainforests, these big animals vanish.
And the big question is why? You hear about the overkill hypothesis, humans hunting them out, changing habitats.
Or the climate hypothesis. Maybe the climate shifted dramatically around the same time. The jury's still out, really.
But the result, the consequence is undeniable. No large native animals left that were suitable for domestication.
None. That lottery, the available animal lottery, it just came up empty in Australia and New Guinea in terms of big domesticable mammals. And that shapes everything that follows.
Everything. Okay, so now connect that to the Americas.
We see a similar extinction event there. A bit later, maybe peaking around 11,000 BC.
Which lines up pretty closely with
the arrival, or at least the widespread appearance, of those Clovis hunters. You look at places like the Grand Canyon species, like the Shasta ground sloth, Harrington's mountain goat, and they disappear right around then.
It's wild to think about what the Americas used to be like the Serengeti today, but with giant ground sloths.
And elephants, horses, lions, cheetahs, even camels, all native.
Yeah.
All gone now from the Americas.
So what's also interesting is the archaeology. We seem to have better evidence for people in Australia and New Guinea before 12,000 BC, a longer history there.
That seems to be the case, yes. Stronger evidence for pre-Clovis settlement there.
But in the Americas, finding really solid proof of people before Clovis, despite, massive archaeological effort.
It's much tougher. The evidence is sparser, more debated, even though arguably more digging has happened in the Americas than in Australia.
Okay, so this brings up that whole idea of a head start, right? If a continent was settled earlier, did it get a permanent advantage?
It's tempting to think so, but It's not that simple. Not really a straightforward head start in development terms.
Because once people actually get somewhere, populating a whole continent can happen pretty fast.
Surprisingly fast, yeah. The New World, from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego. Probably less than 1,000 years for people to spread everywhere.
Okay, less than 1,000 years. Though adapting to really tough places like the Arctic, that takes longer.
Oh, sure. Extreme environments take time. The high Arctic, maybe 9,000 years before people really adapted and settled in properly.
But look at somewhere like New Zealand. The Maori arrive relatively late.
Very late, historically speaking.
And yet, they adapt incredibly quickly. They find the good stone sources within a century. They hunt the moa, those giant birds, to extinction in just a few more centuries. And then you see all these different societies developing.
Exactly. From hunter-gatherers on some islands to intensive farmers on others, it shows very rapid diversification and adaptation, even with a late start.
So just being there first doesn't lock things in. Which brings us to what many argue is the real driver: food production.
Ah, yes, agriculture. The indirect path to guns, germs, and steel.
How does that work? How does farming lead to, well, all of that?
Well, the big thing, the truly transformative thing about domesticating plants and animals is it lets you feed way more people from the same patch of land.
Denser population.
Much denser populations. Plus, a subtle lifestyle changes things. Hunter-gatherer women, constantly moving, tend to space out births, maybe every 4 years or so. They can only carry one young child easily.
Right. Makes sense.
But farming families, staying put, they can have children closer together, more food, shorter birth intervals, boom. Population growth, potential skyrockets.
It's a total game changer for density.
Absolutely. And where and when food production started independently or got adopted from neighbors, that explains a huge chunk of why some regions became the historical haves and others the have-nots.
But it wasn't like flicking a switch, right? People didn't just wake up one day and become farmers.
Not at all. It took thousands of years. A very slow transition. For a long time, people probably did a mix, hunting, gathering wild plants, but also maybe tending a few useful ones.
And the domestication itself. Sometimes it wasn't even intentional at first.
Often not. Early farmers, they'd just save seeds from the plants they liked best. Maybe the ones with the biggest seeds, or the ones that weren't bitter, or ones whose seeds didn't scatter everywhere before they could be harvested.
Like choosing the less poisonous ones by accident.
Exactly. Think about bitter almonds. Wild ones can be deadly. Over generations of people just happening to collect and replant the slightly less bitter ones, you eventually get the safe, edible almonds we have today. Unconscious selection.
Wow. And the timing for different crops. It's all over the place.
Completely. Peas, maybe 8,000 BC. Olives, around 4,000 BC. But strawberries, really only domesticated in the Middle Ages. Pecans, even later.
So why didn't things like acorns get domesticated? Oaks seem useful.
Good question. It comes down to the specific biological traits of the plants. Some are just much harder to manipulate or control genetically, or their life cycles are too slow, or the payoff wasn't big enough compared to other options. Which brings us to geographic luck.
Ah, the Fertile Crescent, the classic example.
Right. It just happened to have this amazing concentration of wild plants that were almost pre-adapted for domestication, especially those big-seeded grasses like wild wheat and barley.
Pine corn, emmer, barley.
Yes. And crucially, they were self-pollinating, which makes selection easier, and they were high in protein. Compare that to early rice in East Asia or corn in the Americas, lower protein content initially.
And it wasn't just the climate, because other places have that Mediterranean climate.
Exactly. California, Chile, southwestern Australia, South Africa, similar climates, but they didn't develop indigenous agriculture. They lacked that suite of easily domesticable native plants.
There's that site, Tel Abu Hurera.
Yes, in Syria. Fascinating place. It shows hunter-gatherers living there before agriculture, using a huge range of wild plants. And many of those same plants were the ones later domesticated right there in that region.
So the potential was just in the wild plants themselves.
It really suggests that having the right raw materials, those domesticable species, was incredibly important, a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, plants are crucial. But what about animals? The ancient 14.
Yes. Those few large domesticated mammal species, they played a massive, massive role. And again, Eurasia just hit the jackpot.
How so?
Just look at the number of potential candidates. We're talking the large terrestrial herbivores or omnivores, over 100 pounds or so.
Okay.
Eurasia had something like 72 species that fit that bill. Compare that to sub-Saharan Africa, maybe 51. The Americas might have had a similar number to Africa before the extinction.
Before the megafauna died off.
Right. And Australia. Only 1 or 2 candidates, max. Just a huge disparity in the available pool.
But it wasn't just the number, right?
Hmm.
Not every big animal is easy to domesticate.
Not at all.
Huh.
There are specific reasons why most weren't domesticated. Diet is one, feeding picky eaters or carnivores is tough. Growth rate, they need to grow fast enough to be worthwhile. Breeding habits, some just won't breed reliably in captivity. Temperament, obviously, you don't want
Oh.
something that's constantly trying to kill you.
Like zebras, maybe?
Zebras are a classic example. Nasty disposition, apparently. And crucially, social structure. The best candidates live in herds with clear dominance hierarchies.
Why is that important?
Because humans can then essentially hijack that social structure, stepping in as the leader. The animals imprint on humans and follow them. Animals that are solitary or territorial or lack that follow the leader instinct, like most deer and antelope, or North American bighorn sheep, are much harder, if not impossible, to domesticate effectively.
Okay, so Eurasia had the plants and the animals with the right characteristics, but how did this food production package spread? Was it smooth?
Far from smooth. There's this interesting idea called preemptive domestication, because wild ancestors of crops or animals often had different genetic varieties in different places.
Right.
You could get similar domestication events happening independently, like maybe wheat was domesticated slightly differently in several parts of the Fertile Crescent around the same time. It shows some pathways were just more likely.
But actual spread between regions was tough.
Very tough sometimes. Geography and ecology threw up huge barriers, those Fertile Crescent crops. They spread east and west fairly easily along similar latitudes, but going south into Africa, they hit a wall. They couldn't cross the tropics easily, and then they stopped completely at the Fish River in South Africa because the climate changed again.
And animals, pack animals.
Huge difference. Eurasia had horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, but Mesoamerica and the Andes, their only domestic animal of any size was the llama alpaca, which couldn't pull a plow and wasn't ridden like a horse. That limits transport, trade, warfare, farming.
And corn spreading north from Mexico into North America, that took ages.
Thousands of years, because the original tropical varieties weren't adapted to the shorter growing seasons and different daylight hours further north. It had to slowly evolve those adaptations.
And even within North America.
The arid lands of Texas and the southern plains were a big barrier separating the farming cultures of the southeast from the southwest. Diffusion was slow. Same between China and western Eurasia, mountains and deserts made exchange difficult for a long, long time. Each developed quite separately initially.
Okay, so food production means denser populations. Denser populations living close to animals. You mentioned germs earlier. This is where that comes in.
This is exactly where it comes in. It's a crucial, often grim part of the story. Those dense Eurasian farming populations living cheek by jowl with their domesticated animals.
Unwittingly creating disease labs.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Ideal conditions for pathogens to jump from animals to humans and evolve into epidemic crowd diseases. And it's actually surprising how recently many of these big killers first show up in the historical record.
Like smallpox, measles.
Smallpox maybe around 1600 BC, mumps maybe 400 BC, measles probably later still. These weren't necessarily ancient human diseases in their epidemic form. They evolved.
And these crowd diseases, they have certain features.
Typically, yeah. They spread fast. They cause acute illness. You get sick quickly. Then you'd either recover or die relatively quickly. If you recover, you're usually immune. And importantly, they tend to need large, dense populations to sustain themselves. Otherwise, they burn out. And they become restricted mostly to humans.
And they mostly came from animals.
The evidence strongly suggests yes. Many human diseases started as animal diseases. Measles likely came from rinderpest in cattle. Smallpox, maybe from camelpox or cowpox. Influenza from pigs and ducks. The pathogen jumps, adapts to humans, sometimes involving intermediate hosts like fleas or lice.
Like typhus, you mentioned that.
Typhus is a fascinating example.
Mm-hmm.
Probably started in rats, spread by rat fleas. Then adapted to human body lice, allowing it to thrive in crowded human conditions. Now there's even a cycle involving flying squirrels in North America. Pathogens just keep evolving.
It's evolution playing out. The myxomatosis virus in Australian rabbits.
A perfect, if tragic, example. Introduced to kill rabbits, it was initially incredibly lethal. But the virus strains that were slightly less deadly, allowing the rabbit host to live longer and spread the virus more effectively, were the ones that ultimately became dominant. Viruses evolve for their own propagation, not necessarily to be maximally lethal.
So Eurasians lived with these diseases for centuries, millennia, building up some immunity.
Exactly. Generations exposed, building partial genetic resistance and childhood immunities. But in the Americas,
They didn't have that same long history or as many domesticated animals packed together with people.
Right. Few, if any, major crowd diseases seem to have originated there. So when Europeans arrived carrying this arsenal of
It was
germs,
catastrophic.
utterly catastrophic. Mortality rates estimated as high as 95% in some areas. Disease often raced ahead of the actual explorers or conquerors clearing the way. Societies like the Mississippian chiefdoms in North America just collapsed.
And it wasn't just the Americas.
No. Same story played out elsewhere. The Zanon people in South Africa, Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders in Fiji, Tonga, Hawaii. Devastating impacts when confronted with these novel Eurasian diseases. A huge factor in the power shift.
Okay, so food production fuels population density, which fuels disease evolution, but also technology.
Yes, absolutely. That food surplus isn't just feeding more mouths, it's freeing up hands. People can specialize.
Potters, weavers, metal workers, priests, soldiers.
Exactly. Specialists who aren't directly farming can develop new skills, new tools, new knowledge. And writing. That's another huge consequence.
Where did writing start?
The earliest clear independent inventions seem to be Sumer in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, in Mesoamerica maybe around 600 BC. Egyptian hieroglyphs popped up soon after Sumerian, and Chinese writing later still. It's possible the idea of writing spread, even if the specific scripts were invented locally.
And alphabets came later.
Much later. A revolutionary step. Early Semitic scripts just used consonants. Then the Greeks added vowels. The key was having a limited number of signs representing sounds, rather than whole words or syllables. Easier to learn, more flexible.
Our alphabet still has roots way back then.
Deep roots. The order of letters, even some of the names, echo those ancient Semitic systems from over 3,000 years ago.
So food surpluses, specialization, writing. This also allows for bigger, more complex societies.
It's almost a prerequisite. You see this general progression, though it's not always linear, from small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, usually egalitarian.
To tribes, maybe larger, settled groups, often linked by kinship.
Right. Then chiefdoms, where you have hereditary leaders, clear social ranking, maybe control over multiple villages, and resources starting to be centrally collected and redistributed.
And finally, states. Central government, laws, taxes, bureaucracy.
States are the most complex. Monopoly on force, true political centralization, often multi-ethnic. The key is that managing larger, denser populations requires more sophisticated ways to resolve conflicts, organize labor, manage resources. Food production makes that possible, and eventually, maybe even necessary.
Okay, let's circle back to Australia and New Guinea, a real contrast there. Why did Australia, with 40,000 plus years of human history, remain largely hunter-gatherer? Again, definitely not about the people.
No, it boils down to the environment again. But New Guinea is fascinating because agriculture did develop there independently.
In the highlands?
Yes, they domesticated local plants like taro, bananas, yams, sugarcane. They even got sweet potatoes later, probably from South America somehow, plus pigs and chickens eventually came in from Southeast Asia.
So why didn't New Guinea become, say, a fertile crescent?
Limitations again. The terrain is incredibly rugged, fragmented, lots of small, isolated populations in different valleys. That makes it hard to build large political units, hard for innovations to spread, hard to support lots of non-farming specialists. Limited scope for large-scale development compared to the big continental land masses.
In Australia?
Lacked the easily domesticable plants and animals we talked about. But Aboriginal Australians weren't passive. They developed incredibly sophisticated knowledge of their environment and managed it actively, using fire stick farming.
Using fire to shape the landscape.
Exactly. To encourage the growth of useful plants, clear undergrowth, attract game animals. It was a form of environmental management to boost food resources, just not agriculture in the plow and crop sense.
And when Europeans arrived in Australia?
They succeeded because they imported the entire Eurasian package. The crops, the animals, the metal tools, the weapons, the diseases, the political structures. It wasn't local superiority, it was imported advantage developed over millennia elsewhere.
It really drives home the power of that package. Now, Polynesia, you said that's like a smaller test case.
It really is. A fantastic natural experiment. You have people with a common origin spreading across this huge ocean area, settling islands with vastly different environments.
Big islands, small islands, volcanic islands, coral atolls, isolated ones in groups.
All sorts. And what develops?
Yeah.
A whole spectrum of societies. On the resource-poor, isolated Chatham Islands, people actually reverted to a simpler hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
Really? They lost some of the original toolkit.
Seems so. But on larger, richer volcanic islands like Hawaii or Tonga, you get intensive agriculture, dense populations, real economic specialization.
Like people who just made tools or just fished.
Yes, or specialized craft production. On Malai, a small island with little farming land, the people became specialists in pottery, trading it with other islands. You see complex social structures emerge, chiefs, commoners, sometimes elaborate hierarchies, and political organization ranging from independent villages to multi-island proto-empires.
And this variation lines up with the environment.
Strongly. Island size, isolation, fertility, terrain. They all correlate with the complexity of the society that developed there. Easier terrain often led to larger, more unified political units, like in Tonga or Hawaii.
Hawaii was particularly complex.
Extremely. Highly stratified society, powerful chiefs, massive public works, sophisticated irrigation, a real pinnacle of Polynesian political development, driven by its specific environmental opportunities.
So Polynesia really mirrors the big continental patterns, just on a smaller scale. Fascinating. Let's touch briefly on China, clearly a major center.
Absolutely. An early and independent center of food production in East Asia, developing its own unique set of crops, technologies, writing, and large states. And China's influence spread significantly, especially southwards.
Into Southeast Asia.
Yes, there was a major process of sanification that spread of Chinese farming, language, culture, sometimes displacing or absorbing the original inhabitants of places like southern China and parts of Vietnam.
But Europe, for a long time, Europe was actually kind of a backwater, wasn't it, compared to the Fertile Crescent or China?
For much of the last 10,000 years, yes. Major innovations often came to Europe from the East agriculture, from the Fertile Crescent, later influences from the Islamic world, technologies like gunpowder or the compass from China.
So the huge question is, why did Europe eventually surge ahead and surpass those earlier centers?
That's one of history's biggest questions. You can point to more immediate, proximate factors in Europe, maybe the rise of merchants, capitalism, patents, maybe less centralized empires compared to China.
But those are symptoms almost, or intermediate causes.
Exactly. We need to ask why those things arose in Europe. One powerful argument looks back at the environment. The Fertile Crescent, the cradle of agriculture, might have been ecologically fragile. Thousands of years of farming, grazing, deforestation in that dry climate led to severe environmental degradation, salinization, erosion.
So it essentially exhausted itself.
To some extent, yes. Power shifted westwards, toward Europe, which had a more resilient environment, more rainfall, more robust forests and soils, maybe better able to withstand intensive exploitation for longer. The environmental foundation was just stronger in Europe for long-term development, perhaps?
A sobering thought about sustainability. Now, it can't all be environment, can it? What about just weird cultural things or individual?
No, absolutely. It's not 100% environmental determinism. There's definitely room for cultural idiosyncrasies, things that start small, maybe randomly, but get locked in and have long-term effects. And the impact of specific individuals or chance events can be huge.
Like the example of the assassination attempt on Hitler.
A chilling example. It failed by such a narrow margin. If it had succeeded,
Yeah.
world history would be unrecognizably different. It shows contingency, chance, and individual actions absolutely matter.
So putting it all together, can we really study history like a science? It's not like physics with controlled experiments.
Well, science just means knowledge. It's about finding knowledge, using methods appropriate for the field. You can't rerun the Roman Empire in a lab, obviously.
Right.
But history shares a lot with other historical sciences like evolutionary biology, geology, cosmology. They all deal with unique past events, complex causation, reconstructing what happened based on surviving evidence, identifying patterns. They rely on natural experiments, comparing different situations that nature or history provides.
Like comparing continents or Polynesian islands.
Exactly. So in that broad sense, seeking evidence-based explanations for historical patterns, yes, history can absolutely be approached scientifically. It's just a different kind of science dealing with immense complexity and contingency.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, the main takeaway, the core argument here.
It's that the vastly different historical trajectories of societies on different continents stem primarily from differences in their environments, not in the people themselves.
Continental shape, isolation, the wild plants and animals available for domestication, the disease landscape, how easily things could spread. Those are the ultimate factors.
Those are the deep roots shaping why history unfolded the way it did, leading indirectly to the guns, germs, and steel that characterized those later global encounters.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big thought to chew on. Given how much these deep environmental factors shaped thousands of years of history, What are the long-term consequences of today's world? A world that's hyper-connected, where technology changes incredibly fast, where environmental impacts are global? What does that mean for our future trajectory?
It's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Where does human history go from here? It's certainly something to ponder. And if this has sparked your interest, definitely dig deeper. Read Diamond's book, explore more history, geography, anthropology. There's so much more to learn